Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on responsible recruitment and modern slavery, theory, reality, and lessons to learn. I hope everybody can hear me loud and clear. If not, please send us a message. And also, please make sure that you're all on mute. We have a lot of participants today, so we want to ensure there is no background noise. So my name is Silvia Mera, and I'm Program Director here at the Mekong Club. And it is my pleasure to facilitate the webinar today. So a few reminders before we kick off. The webinar is being recorded, as you can see on the slide. A link to the recording will be shared with you all in a few days. Along with the link, we will be sharing a short survey where we hope to get your feedback on the webinar content. It's going to be, as I said, a short survey, so we encourage you all to please share your feedback with us. This is going to be very helpful to put together our webinars moving forward. This first webinar of our Responsible Recruitment series has received a great response. We currently have over 160 people signed up. So definitely a lot of interest out there on this topic, and I assume a lot of questions from our attendees. Some of you have already sent some questions in advance upon signing up. So thank you for sending the questions over. We took note of them. If you have additional questions during the webinar, please send them through text message by using the chat function on the Zoom platform, as you see in the screenshot on the slide, and we will try our best to address as many as possible before our time is up. Before I introduce our guest speaker, allow me to give you a quick overview of our organization. So the Mekong Club is an anti-slavery NGO, and our mission is to eradicate modern slavery through private sector engagement, and to do so by inspiring and supporting businesses to play a critical role in this fight. You can see some of our members here. We run an association of businesses that is membership-based. So these are some of the logos of the members of our association. We are currently working with 4 working groups: apparel, retail, hospitality, and financial services. However, we have member companies that belong to other sectors as well. Our association hosts quarterly in-person meetings as well as an annual joint conference. Upon signing up, members can attend meetings and access a network of like-minded companies where there are plenty of opportunities for learning, best practice sharing, and joint action. Members also access a number of additional services, such as our technical support, a number of expert webinars like this one, workshops and events. And last but not least, they have access to a portal of tools and resources that help them advance their anti-slavery efforts. Our tools include in-person training and awareness raising, a multi-language e-learning curriculum, guidelines on relevant topics such as transparency in supply chain legislation, as well as remediation, up-to-date information on slavery, a number of reports and resources on relevant themes. And then we have, separate from membership, what we call a technology incubator. This is an incubator of technology-based projects, such as the Worker Voice tool and responsible recruitment tool through blockchain, which we develop and pilot with interested parties and stakeholders. So on that note, on responsible recruitment, let me introduce the topic for today, which is responsible recruitment theory, practice, and lessons learned. Our association focus theme for the upcoming year until September 2020 will be responsible recruitment. And ethical recruitment, migration with dignity, and corporate accountability are all interlinked themes, which sit under the second pillar of the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. and they are a priority for many of the companies we work with. On this base, Mekong Club has decided to be offering a number of activities and additional webinars in the coming months on various aspects of the very broad responsible recruitment conversation. So we wanted to start with setting the scene with this first webinar and discuss what are some of the on-the-ground realities of this topic. I think many of you are aware there are well-known guidelines out there from authoritative sources that elaborate on the principles every company should embed in its recruitment policies, such as no fees paid by the workers, no retention of documents, good living standards, freedom to change employment, non-discrimination, and so on. So these are all principles that need to apply from the moment of recruitment, during employment, and through further employment or safe return home. These frameworks set was the ideal migration pathway and recruitment process but we were asking ourselves, once we know all about the theory, what is the reality? What is the on-the-ground scene, and what are some of the challenges that it brings? So with that, I am pleased to be joined today by Phil Marshall, who's board member and senior advisor at Mekong Club, and director of private sector engagement at the Research and Communications Group. Phil has over 30 years of experience in anti-trafficking and has been focusing on responsible recruitment as part of his most recent work. Phil, can you hear us? And if you're there and you're ready, over to you.
So I just wanted to start by talking about some of the underlying realities. So I think the first thing to emphasize is that migration is generally a good thing, that a huge number of workers benefit their lives, their own lives, the lives of their family through migration. It's beneficial to sending countries in terms of remittances. It's beneficial to receiving countries in terms of flexibility in the labour force. And the role of migration and poverty alleviation has long been recognised, with 40 years ago, the World Bank saying that restricting migration was a way of locking people into poverty. So I think we need to keep that in the background, that migration is generally does help people improve their lives and helps many people get out of poverty. But at the same time, many workers remain vulnerable to exploitation, and in particular, those who are in the lower skilled categories. And one of the reasons for that is because globally the supply of lower skilled migrants greatly exceeds the demand for those migrants. So one of the consequences of that is workers are willing to accept sub-legal conditions. So I want to talk just a little bit to illustrate that. A friend of mine who's been working in compliance for many years, they set up outside a factory for a couple of days because they were concerned about the factory's treatment of waste, which was supposed to be done internally. In the course of that, he noticed that the bus delivering the workers in the morning was a different company from the bus picking up workers in the evening. And there's really no reason that a company would have a factory would organize two different bus companies. So what he did was he followed the bus, and he found that bus drove to another factory where all the workers got out of the bus, walked into the second factory. The workers from the second factory got out of the factory, went into the same back bus and went to the first factory. And what was going on was that workers were working two back-to-back 8-hour shifts, but they were working in different factories so that the employers had different names on their register so that they were not having to pay overtime. Now, this highlights three points that I want to come back to a bit later. One is that the ways that employers and in a way migrants were able to work around the law. The second is that the workers are tolerating this. even though they weren't being paid overtime, even though they're working huge hours. And the third one is a question about just how efficient a worker is. After 5 days, 5 or 6 days, where they've been working back-to-back 16-hour shifts. Sorry, I think somebody's got their microphone on. There's a fair bit of background car noise coming through from somebody. So just to say, there was, so there's what I would call criminal space already exists. We've got a lot of workers who are willing to, even under exploitative conditions, accept those conditions because they are better than what life would face them at home. And I think that's a reality that we need to keep in mind, because as we start to improve things for workers, there is a potential for this criminal space to expand. And that will lead to more and more attempts by exploitative agents to take advantage of that gap between supply and demand. At the moment also, the situation exists as illustrated by two things. One is a huge information imbalance, which makes workers heavily dependent often on brokers to get information about migration. And the second is a failure of duty bearers. And I don't want to talk too much about that, but essentially what we're talking about is corruption and complicity and how many different actors benefit from the status quo. Right, so I'm just trying to move on to the next slide without any, all right, here we go. All right, so, recruitment and forced labour. So I want to talk now specifically about the issue of forced labour. And I think the ILO has 10 indicators of forced labour. But really, it comes down to a smaller number of factors that bind the workers to the workplace. So one obviously is force or confinement, where workers are simply unable to physically escape their situation. The obvious example is fishing boats. Another example can be domestic work. The second is lack of access to documents. That's well documented: passport, identification, withholding or confiscation of these documents, threats against the worker or the family, withheld wages, which means that workers often stay in a factory waiting to get the money that's owed to them. And a reasonably common strategy appears to be for employers to say that they have to wait to get the revenue from the goods being made by the workers until they can pay them. And then just before payday, the police will turn up and arrest and workers. And we've seen that happen even with workers who are in the country perfectly legally with perfectly legal work permits. But the other one is debt. And according to ILO and the Global Slavery Index, that accounts for 51% of the estimated 16 million people in forced labour in the private economy, but 70% for agriculture, domestic work and manufacturing. So even though there are a lot of other bad things that happen to people in the work environment, physical abuse, unpaid overtime, it's really these factors that make it into forced labour, because without any of these binding factors, the workers could simply leave the situation they're in. All right, so in terms of debt, where does debt come from? So recruitment fees, both legal and illegal. Warehousing, where people are recruited in advance and then may have to wait for a period of time to get jobs. And sometimes that will actually literally be in something that's like a warehouse, where they'll end up having to pay accommodation as well. They may have come from a main centre. They may have come, from a rural area to a main centre. Or sometimes it might just be, they might be remaining in the community, but in the meantime, they've borrowed money and they're accumulating interest at usurious rates. Mandatory training courses, where people have to pay often quite significant amounts of money to get training, which often is particularly worthless, that tends to focus mainly on the responsibilities that workers have, certainly not their rights or entitlements. Interest rates, usurious interest rates, I've already talked about. It's often very hard for particularly the poorest migrants to get loans at decent conditions. And then it's perpetuated by hidden costs and trickery. So charges for accommodation, excessive charges for goods and services, etc. So there's a widespread recognition of recruitment fees as the centre of the debt problem. But I think we also need to look at what makes this debt dangerous, because of course not everybody that's in debt is vulnerable. And one of the key things is the lack of transparency. So in talking to migrant workers, we've come across a lot of migrant workers that were in what we would call exploitative, had been exploited in the recruitment process. But the information and the degree of exploitation was essentially what had been promised them at the beginning. So they had made their decision on having to pay $400 for a passport. They'd taken that into account. So even though it was exploitative, it hadn't, they'd factored it into their decision making, so it hadn't actually put them at significant risk of getting into a forced labour situation. I want to talk a little bit now about the employer pays principle. There's the principle that employers should pay the costs of recruitment fees and that they should not be the costs paid by migrant workers. So there's general consensus around this principle, originating, I think, from the DACA principles on migrant workers, the ILO convention, which bans the charging of recruitment fees to workers. And I think it's really important to highlight that for migrants that benefit from this, it is a fantastic initiative. It's really life-changing for many migrants who are able to migrate without paying recruitment fees. And I think for individual companies that are listening, we would strongly encourage adopting this. I also want to talk about it from the point of view of it as a blanket policy and as a recruiter requirement. As I said, as we improve conditions for migrants, that's an increase in the criminal space. There's lots of opportunities for exploitative agents to work around our efforts, and we'll talk about some examples of that in a minute. We are in a situation at the moment, which is probably my biggest concern, where law-abiding recruiters cannot meet ethical requirements. So we have, for example, recruiters in Myanmar who are following all of their local laws. They do not have a viable business model if they are not going to charge fees to any of their clients. They're at the moment excluded from most of the ethical recruitment schemes. A third consequence is that employer deductions must be off book. So for example, in Thailand, they've banned employer deductions, employers making deduction from their wages, because employers aren't supposed to be doing that. But of course that still happens. So because the employers aren't legally allowed to do that, they do that through a separate book. The problem with that is that the migrants do not have a record of it. So they are reliant not just on the honesty of the employers, but the employers not making a legitimate mistake. So that's been a reduction in transparency, which, as I've already mentioned, is one of the big issues for migrants. And the other thing is it rules out the idea that we can provide low interest loans, that we might have an initiative which helps migrants to borrow recruitment fees in order to, at a rate that doesn't put them at greater risk. So these are all things that as we move towards the employer pays principle, we have to consider. How do we avoid making the perfect the enemy of the good? One thing that's been talked about as an interim step is a regulated fee, where the government sets a regulated and hopefully not highly exploitative fee. Now, one of the things we noticed, again, taking the Myanmar example, was when the government was discussing this, the recruiters had to be a lot more open about the actual costs. So we started to find a lot more information about all the backhanders that the recruiters were having to pay, particularly to the human resources people. So they were of the companies that they're recruiting for, they had to host them when they were visiting, take all their expenses, including their entertainment expenses. They also had to pay backhanders for the quota. So one of the things that it does do is it does increase transparency. It also means that recruiters in the interim can be ethical. We're saying that recruiters who charge the regulated fee can still be classified as ethical. It maintains their viable business model until we can evolve to the next step. The other thing about setting a fee is it encourages professionalisation. So one of the big problems in the past with recruitment is because all the costs have been passed on to the migrants, there hasn't been a lot of demand for efficiency in the recruitment process. And in fact, so when you actually can set a fee, that means that it's more likely that recruitment agencies are going to have to compete on service. It doesn't concede, I've used the term an unnecessary deal breaker. It's probably not quite the right term, but at the moment we have a situation where many migrants are willing to pay some kind of fee. Many employers aren't willing to pay this fee, and we're attempting to step in the middle and say, well, no, that's not, that agreement that's acceptable to these two parties here is not acceptable to us. And I think that that's something we have to reflect on. But at the same time, there's a risk that undermines the employer pays principle, which we're thinking to get at. So, for me, I think my own personal view is that it's a question of timing, is that we should be pursuing employer pays principle as the principle that we're pursuing, but recognizing that there might be some interim steps on the way that can move us towards that goal in ways that benefit more migrants over time. Somebody asked in a pre-seminar question about recruitment fees and how that's defined in different countries. I've put a link down below to an ILO study which covers more than 90 countries on this issue. Okay, I've talked a lot about fees, and that's because of the link between fees and debt, and the link between debt and people being in a forced situation. But of course, ethical recruitment isn't just about fees. It's about legal compliance, ethical and professional conduct, free of charge services, we've discussed, transparent and ethical terms of engagement, transparent wages, deductions and benefits, healthy, safe, exploitation-free working and living conditions. And I know that a lot of companies here have had issues with the living conditions, with the standard of accommodation and the charges for those, and access to remedy and functional credible grievance mechanisms, which we'll come to in a moment. So just to give a shout out to ESRA Institute, who is the source of this, and also some of the information on the next slide. So a couple of years ago, I was doing some work in conjunction with the ESRA Institute, and we talked to a lot of migrants, and we asked the migrants what it was that was important to them, and the priorities that they came up with were in order: plentiful overtime. 66 hours was kind of the most commonly quoted figure. They wanted what they were promised. Again, the issue of transparency. They wanted faster recruitment processes. They wanted lower recruitment fees and higher hourly rates, and they kind of grouped those two things together as a better economic package overall. Somebody to talk to, not always about the big stuff, but why people are getting paid differently, etc. Just people, the lack of trusted sources, because of course another thing that happens in some of these factory environments is that the factory will use one interpreter who will end up with an awful lot of power, particularly if there aren't other people around that actually have a basic understanding of the other language. So you get a gatekeeper in terms of the information, which is something that we need to keep in mind in terms of auditing processes. And I've also put other here because I think we didn't prompt any of the answers in this, apart from fees, because it's such a current topic. But there are other things that migrants, we suspect, probably would have identified if they had even thought about they're on the table. So somebody was asking about the Better Factories, Better Factories initiative in Cambodia. I don't know so much about that, but one of the interesting things for me is the strong focus on road safety, because they've had a huge number of road deaths and road accidents. So that's a kind of thing that you can do when you're taking a more holistic view of migrant welfare. Another which came up in the study that we were doing with Plan was children, childcare. So migrants were faced with the choice of either leaving their children with aging relatives, or bringing them but not having appropriate childcare facilities. So that is a good example for me of something which would be relatively low cost, which would not be challenging existing norms, but would make a big difference for migrants. Okay, so having talked to migrants about what they wanted, let's look at what's actually happening. Okay, so a lot of initiatives are restricting overtime, commonly to 48 hours. And I think there's an idea that if workers were paid more, they wouldn't need to work much overtime. But my experience of migrant work is that people want to earn as much money as they can over a shorter period if they can. So I don't think that's necessarily true. They want what they were promised. And some of the things that are happening now are reducing transparency. So I've already talked about Thailand. In Nepal, people are a lot less open now about what fees are being charged because they know they're not supposed to be doing it. So I'm not saying that's a justification for allowing people to charge fees, but we need to deal with these transparency aspects. They want faster recruitment processes. And some of what's happening now in attempts to make migration safer, we're adding more safeguards. So a good example of that is that work quota in Myanmar has to be approved by high levels of government, which is meant to make things safer, but slows things down. So it's actually counter to what is important to migrants. I've already talked about the willingness to pay in terms of fees, which we need to take into account. And again, I'm not coming out against the employer pays principle. I'm just saying we need to think about the realities of how we apply that. Somebody to talk to. This isn't really a direct follow on from that point, but I think it's really important to highlight that worker feedback and worker voice are not the same thing. That a lot of times workers are asked to provide feedback on the issues that we think are important, which obviously restricts them from being able to give feedback on what's important to workers. So I think it's very important that we acknowledge that if we want to give a genuine voice to workers, things have to be framed in terms of what's important to workers, not just to us. All right, I've called this slide, and I think part of the introduction to the presentation, Newton's third law. Newton's third law of motion is that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. This isn't quite the same because they're not equal and opposite, but I want to highlight some examples of things that people have done, that things that we've discovered for people working around our attempts to regulate and improve the sector, because I think it's very important that we understand this. So photocopying is expensive. A direct quote to an ILO colleague who was looking to make up the money that had been taken for charging recruitment fees by finding all these other ways to increase the costs and increase the money that he was getting out of migrants. It's twice as much as before, but nothing on the other side. So Thailand has banned recruiters charging fees. What happens in Cambodia is that the fees that were previously charged by the Thai agencies are now just added into the cost of the Cambodian agencies who just pass them across the border. Fees, what fees? Again, in the Nepal example, there's now a lot less openness about what actual fees are. I know you thought you were working in a factory, but. So one of the other things that's happened is an attempt to get rid of some of the recruitment agencies in the receiving countries. And that has a lot of benefits in cutting out costs, cutting out a middle entity. But it's difficult for small organizations. And one of the things that's happened in Thailand is small scale enterprises are having trouble with the requirements. So they're now actually getting their upstream buyers to help them recruit workers. The problem for that is that workers arrive thinking they're doing one job, but then they find out they're doing quite a different job. Another example, clearly a zero fee job is worth paying a premium for. So we're finding reports from Vietnam that a premium is that free jobs are paying a premium for. They know that they're worth a good employer. So they think, well, this is going to be a good job. It's much more attractive than another job. There are other countries that we can get workers from. Okay, so one example of that is in the Philippines. As the Philippines is looking to, they've taken a lot of initiatives to try to get to try and improve life for their workers, but there is a tendency for a race to the bottom. Increased compliance, increased bribes. That's an obvious one. That as there becomes more red tape, there's more opportunities for governments to take increased bribes, and of course, the other thing that happens is that unethical recruiters it's much easier for unethical recruitments to find money to pay that than for ethical recruitments, who obviously ethical recruiters do not have a money source to pay bribes. He's not a corporal, he's a team leader. That's my experience from experience in Italy. So in Italy, there are very powerful agents called corporali, or corporal, and caporali, sorry. And they have traditionally taken a very strong role in exploiting migrant workers. So a couple of years ago, there was a law which banned them. And the problem was that they perform a role that nobody else does. So they have the language skills, they have the transport skills, they have the contact with the workers, they have the contact with the bosses. So what happened was they were banned, but there was nobody to take their place. So what's happened now is that they're now just called something else. So they're now referred to as capo squadra or team leader rather than corporali. So they've just used a term that's not in the law. And this leads to, I think, a very important point, which is about brokers and the role of brokers at a community level. So brokers are often the risks for migrants come in the first mile. And that's, in the past, one of the things we've been talking about is, can we remove these exploitative brokers from the process? But another way of looking at that is that they currently perform a role that nobody else can. So do we, do we want to think about whether they're a legitimate part of the recruitment process and somehow including them in them rather than attempting to work around these roles? All right, remedy. So I'd say very much that remedy is the missing link in this, and has been for the 20 years that I've been working on these issues. So officially, victims of human trafficking, which is where most of the focus has been so far, have focused on shelters, new livelihoods, and a ticket home. That's the official line, but what actually that's meant in practice is that people have been detained in shelters, often for months at a time, that they could not leave because they didn't have the immigration status. They've got lessons in hairdressing or sewing, which may may not be good for a livelihood when they get home, and they've been mandatorily returned home. So they've had no other option to go home. So a situation where if you come forward with a complaint, you might be in a shelter for a long period of time, probably while the people that you're complaining against are going to be out on bail. You'll be trained in things a small range of things, which may or may not be useful for you, and you'll end up going home. And for many migrants, that's the absolutely worst thing that can happen. So we had a situation where there were 68 victims of trafficking identified, but when the options were explained to them, 64 of those 68 chose not to come forward. Okay, so there's any number of reasons why migrants will not come forward. Fear, lack of trust in authorities, the possibilities I've said of being sent home, the shame of being exploited or having to go home, or a lack of evidence that they are actually going to benefit from it, that there's going to be anything that happens to them that's worth them coming forward. And despite that though, most grievance mechanisms are passive, by which I mean that even where grievance mechanisms are in place, people have to the idea that people will come forward and that they will have no barriers. I think if there's one takeaway from what we're talking about today, it's that it's really important to understand there are so many barriers to migrants coming forward, and migrants will not necessarily be proactive in terms of coming forward with complaints based on years of experience that no good will come of it. So what does Remedy involve? So we've been doing some work for IOM's labour certification scheme, the International Recruitment Integrity System, or IRIS. And we've essentially said that Remedy has to start with pre-departure training. So there's already opportunities in pre-departure training to be working on Remedy. There needs to introduce workers to their rights, to introduce workers to trade unions if they don't have them in their own country, what the trade unions might do for them, the role of embassies. There's a need to be able to receive complaints and grievances from all different sources, from company hotlines, but also from other NGOs, other community trusted sources. But also, particularly where there is a high chance of exploitation, there is important to have some degree of proactive monitoring. So we're looking at how monitoring can be made, the ways of actually proactively supporting and soliciting feedback from migrants, bearing in mind that not all feedback's negative, not all feedback's complaints, and not all complaints are, and some complaints are just moans. We also need to have a system for dealing with the feedback, which includes grievance and the role of investigation. So investigation of complaints is an area which there hasn't been a lot of work on, and I know that Mekong Club is looking to strengthen that in the future. And then case management data and reporting. So looking at the cases themselves, but also the causes. How did this happen? How can we address this immediate case? But also how can we address the causes to stop that happening in the future? Now, of course, there's costs associated with all that. But one of the things that the Mekong has been talking about is what we're calling the Moongod, where the idea of trying to basically eliminate exploitative labour practice without having a long-term effect on profits. And there are a lot of opportunities for reducing costs. So we have audits by multiple companies. That's something that companies are starting to work on, realising that it's a waste of resources for both the companies themselves and for the people who are being audited. Unnecessary recruitment agencies, as already mentioned, the elimination of recruitment agencies in some destination countries. The issue of whether we can use things like online recruitment to eliminate some of the village level brokers, or at least reduce the number of these, the number of steps. Incentive for churn. So at the moment, because recruiters are allowed to are charging migrants, they have incentivized to have more migrants through a factory, which is not a benefit to the employer or the migrants. So that's an opportunity through reducing churn and improving productivity. Poor workplace management, again linked to that. The reliance on just having workers work more and more hours, as opposed to the idea that happy workers are more productive. Poorly defined regulation, apps. So we've done we did some work recently on looking at different apps against forced labour and human trafficking, and we found well over 200. And I think that a lot of them are doing the same thing. So there's really, when anybody's thinking about doing, there's probably an app for it that already exists. And I think there's also a chance to do more joint work on remedy. And I know that we've also been doing some work with the Ethical Trading Initiative on the principles, looking at remedy principles. And so the idea that companies might actually work together more on the area of remedy. So just in finishing, I'd just like to highlight 3 points. One is we need migrant voice, not just migrant feedback. So we need to make sure that the agenda is not being framed on migrants' behalf. We need more work on remedy that will help both people, but also our programs, because the more work we do on remedy, the more likely we are to identify gaps earlier on in the process. And we need to be aware that every action will generate a reaction, and anticipate and respond to the fact that as people start losing out through recruitment becoming more ethical, there'll be a lot of steps they take to try and safeguard the current status quo. Thank you. I've put up my details here. And I think now we're with question and answer.
Thank you so much, Phil, for this very comprehensive overview. So yes, we do have some questions that the attendees sent us. So let me just jump right into the first one. So the question is, what works to shift recruitment agencies' behavior, and have we seen any success at the sectoral level?
All right, so as part of our company, we have a small team working on Reflex, which stands for Remediating Forced Labour and Exploitation. And I think some of the people who are listening would be familiar with John Dove, Alessandra Spino, and particularly Hannah Plum, who has just come from the IOM Iris team that I was talking about. And Hannah and I were actually talking about this the other day. And she said that from their experience that true believers, she calls them, tended to be companies run by former migrants or younger generations. So where young people had taken over the role of from their parents, they had more focus on human rights. They had more pride in the idea that they might become professional, that they might have a value add, that they might be seen as foremost in their field. And so ego was one of the incentives. So looking at how can we provide the right incentives? Obviously, as I've said before, if they're not 100% fee-free, they can't be 100% free if they can't make a living. And that's where the demand side comes in. Pressure from supplier and brands. So the majority of recruiters who've enrolled in Iris, Hannah was telling me, are doing it for their clients or to attract bigger clients. Again, it comes back to the demand. But there's also the idea that if they're improved, they can charge a premium for their service because they're reducing they're making life easier for the employers, they're giving a better deal. But also regulatory concessions. So something again that Iris was working on was a lot of red tape in the migration process. Could certification schemes for recruiters allow them to fast track this process, which obviously saves costs for recruiters and benefits both employers and migrant workers themselves. These are these are the kinds of incentives that could be looked at. In terms of a sectoral level, I think it's probably too early to tell. There's a number of business-led initiatives. I think Goods Forum, the Responsible Business Alliance, the Leadership Group on Responsible Recruitment. But it does take time to turn around this extremely entrenched model with so much vested interest. I think just in Hong Kong, where the Mekong Club is based, Fair Employment Agency is an interesting example, working with domestic workers. And they've made their model attractive for employers by the quality of their matching and their service. So they've been able to charge employers because the employers know that they're going to get the domestic worker that's right for them, and that they have no interest in the Fair Employment Agency has no interest in them getting a new migrant worker every 6 months. Sorry, just in terms of another example, again, I've talked about ISRA before, and I think they do some very, very good work on the ground. They've got a Golden Dreams app which is kind of like a TripAdvisor for migrants. So migrants are allowed to are able to share information on the recruiters and on the safe, most ethical recruiters and recruitment options. And I think that's a key step in terms of crowding out exploitive behaviour, as we've already talked about. That a lot of the stuff is so entrenched that to try and get it turned around by legislation or by law enforcement, particularly given complicity, is unrealistic. But if we can get migrants to self-select into cleaner migration options, then the more unethical recruiters are going to have to adapt in some way or simply lose their business.
Thank you so much for that. So the second question is a rather long one. It refers to what you mentioned earlier on Better Factories Cambodia. So the question asks, how might we best together cause law in the UK, Europe, Australia, or the United States to require imports only from countries and from sites in such programs, for example, the Better Factory Cambodia? So in other words, how can buyers be required to join and fund these initiatives rather than keep on duplicating non-transparent commercial auditing?
I think
it's a long one.
I mean, part of it is, there needs to be a recognition that the current models aren't sustainable. Yeah, and we've already seen the United States start to take tougher action. They've tightened their laws against the import of goods made by forced labour. And I think that they likely, because I think it mainly at the moment focuses on workplace conditions, but it's likely that will include more of a focus on recruitment. So I think that there is a need for people to recognise that working together, supporting positive models, that the best way to get rid of negative models is probably to support positive alternatives. I think, but we also need to think very carefully about these, about the bans, about outright bans, because a lot of livelihoods are at stake here, not just people who are in situations of massive exploitation. I think so. It's similar to when people find incidents in their supply chains. We don't encourage them to cut the link. You can't improve lives for workers if you're out of the conversation. So I think we need to keep that in mind. I think we also need to keep in mind the use of, banning of import restrictions as a threat, because we've seen this with the US Trafficking Persons Report. We've seen it with the EU Yellow Card, that when that happens, often the country does not focus on the problem itself, but on how to get a pass mark through these, past this threat. So they're not necessarily trying to eliminate the problem, but to go up in the US Trafficking Persons Report or to get the yellow card lifted rather than address the problem. But I do think it's positives that we're starting to look at things that treat this more as an issue around forced labour and as a criminal act than just an issue of ethics. Because we're not just talking about ethics, we're talking about products of crime, products of criminal behaviour.
Okay, thank you. The third question is on roadmaps. So the question asks, is there any roadmap for companies to address migrant workers' ethical recruitment, such as a step-by-step approach? And also, are there any roadmaps on remediation for suppliers to follow? It seems remediation is one of the priorities as well for the companies we work with. So I think this question is shared among many of our attendees today.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've already talked about the 5 steps that we think that are important in a remedy process. There's also, the Mekong Club has a remediation flowchart that we were involved in developing, and that really takes people through the issues of the issues that people need to think about in remediation. And a key thing for that is the preparation. So that there's so much that could be done that needs to be done in preparation for companies to know what will happen, how they're going to manage a crisis, how they're going to manage a report of forced labour in their supply chain, particularly when that's come from an outside source, so that people are prepared in advance. But also, in looking at how you might do that, that leads you to, you can look backwards for that and a whole lot of steps you may take to reduce the likelihood that things will happen. B, look at how you might find out before anybody else if that's taking place, or get at least an early warning. I mean, in terms of a roadmap, I'm not sure other people who are listening may have some specific examples, but I would say the first thing is to understand the labour supply chain, where the workers come from, the recruiters involved, the issues and risks that you face on particular migration pathways. Important to have management systems in place on recruitment with clear policies and procedures, to look at how procurement is affecting how your procurement policies, your deadlines are affecting recruitment, and the need to recruit in haste sometimes, to identify and work with recruiters who are committed to ethical recruitment, understanding that this might take time, and again, to know how you'll manage, how you react when you get a situation, so you're not making policy on the fly, but you've already clearly got in place processes and procedures that you're going to use to deal with an incident.
Thank you. And on your last reference to crisis management, this was another topic that we realized was really of interest for our members. And the Mekong Club ran a workshop on crisis management the 1st of November. And we're looking to replicate it in Hong Kong and Singapore next year. So if any of the attendees is interested in participating, we will be sharing details soon. So stay tuned. Okay, we have another question, and I see somebody also shared a further question through the chat. So we're going to try to address both in the next 10 minutes that we have. So 4th question for you, Phil. How do you consider the diversity of culture and economic status of different countries to establish a universal standard?
Excellent question, I think, and a very key point. I think, you'll have seen from my presentation, I think that understanding of the migrant realities and local realities is really, really crucial, because without that, there's real potential for us to do things which will not only be ineffective, but possibly backfire. I think there's nothing wrong with universal standards. I think they're important, but I think that they need to be provided progressively in ways that are grounded in reality. I think in terms of standards themselves, and a little plug for IRIS, the IOM standard, I think that's worth looking at. A key principle of that is respect for laws in the countries where the recruiter operates. So there are some standards where it is prescriptive, but others where it's around following the local laws. So I think that's worth having a look at. I mean, I think just also on local realities, one of the things that was interesting when we did the legal study for the Mekong Club is most of the countries in the region don't even have a law requiring pay slips. And that seems like an example of a very easy win. That could be introduced. That you know, a lot of the stuff is particularly complicated, but you wouldn't think that introducing a requirement for pay slips was a particularly complicated thing to do in most countries. I think these are the kind of thing that would, so you know, that could be looked at in terms of a universal standard, which then could be applied at a country level. I'm not sure if that answers your question adequately.
Okay, and we have a question that we just got through our chat. So the question is, how do we measure fair wage? How do we benchmark fair wage when it comes to migrant workers? For example, what methods are in place to determine fair wage for migrant workers when they're moving to a more developed location? So when they're moving from their country of origin to a more developed country of destination. So the question is on fair wage measurement and benchmarking, basically.
Yeah, that's not something I can really, that I'm really familiar with. I'm sorry. I will say that in most cases, because you've got a situation where a lot of the people that are most vulnerable are talking about, we're talking about very low in the lower skills. So it tends to be the minimum wage. So a lot of the focus has to be the initial focus has to be on making sure that workers get the basic entitlements, that they're not protecting them from their basic entitlements rather than negotiating more. But I think, Brian, I saw that there's some comment that you have an example. You talked about, I think in domestic workers, that one of the problems, again, in some countries is that domestic workers aren't covered by labour laws. And so that makes it particularly difficult. So there's no labour standards do not necessarily apply to domestic workers. And that's something that has to be developed. And as I think, you know, that Brian's identified the example of domestic helpers from Hong Kong. I think, as I mentioned, there's some good steps being taken in that direction. And again, one of the interesting things about the Hong Kong domestic worker example is that you've got other companies that were initially trying to discredit the Fair Employment Agency now going to learn what their secrets are, the secrets of the business model. So we're seeing the potential of an ethical agency starting to transform the business model. And that's nothing new. I remember in the banking sector in New Zealand years ago, the service was terrible, and then one bank started to improve their standards, and that led that dragged up the whole sector because, you know, people simply because of competition. So sorry, that's not a direct answer to your question, Brian, but yeah, the best I can do.
Thanks so much, Phil. And I think our time is up. Brian said it's good to start with, so great, we answered Brian's question. So good. Yeah, our time is up. As we mentioned, if there is any follow-up, Phil shared his contact, and you know, both him and us at the Mekong Club would be happy to follow up with any of you who have additional questions. Thank you so much, Phil, for joining us today and sharing your views and expertise on this subject, which is very complex, but I hope we helped setting the scene. As I mentioned, we will be hosting a number of webinars and activities and workshops all the way to September 2020, specifically on responsible recruitment. So some things that have been mentioned by Phil today, we're gonna elaborate on things such as the link between finance and responsible recruitment. We're going to focus on ways technology can influence responsible recruitment. We're going to run some workshops where we're going to invite companies to share best practices and case studies. All of this will be shared with our members, of course, and for any interested parties, if you're not members yet, make sure you sign up to our newsletter so you can receive information on these upcoming activities. You can also follow us on our social media so you can stay up to date with all our activities and events. We encourage all of you to consider joining our membership. You can go on our website on the section Your Help under Join the Association, where you can learn more about all the benefits that the association membership includes. And once again, thank you all for joining this first webinar. As I mentioned, a lot of attendees and a lot of interest, and have a great rest of your day.